You know that line that we often tend to tell ourselves about how I need to get my life together before I start doing X? X could in this case mean traveling, learning a new skill, a hobby, a relationship, or just taking a leap and fulfilling your goals. Then years go by, your life still isn't together, and you hopefully realize by now that it's by taking that leap and doing such things that we can actually develop the experience to get our lives together. Well, oddly enough, I think that this is the same kind of logic that many of us take when it comes to electoral politics. A few caveats before we begin. This video is coming from a socialist perspective, and it's designed for socialists, which means that as broadly as possible you would agree with something along the lines of this sentiment. Just that you feel that electoral politics still holds a significant precedent. And if you are more liberal or conservative, then feel free to come along as well. Just be aware that if you have faith in capitalism and liberalism, then none of my points are going to convince you. Just vote. It's only 20 minutes out of your day. Let me clarify. Voting is not really the problem. The problem is electoralism, to which I am defining in this video as that particular systemic hell which essentializes the status quo and prioritizes political energy being pushed into working within the system to achieve democratic ends. When it functions like this, it's very important that we start remembering that your individual vote has literally zero power. And because this isn't an office meeting where there's like 10 people and we all confer and discuss, we're talking about potentially thousands if not millions of very different people. It's all well and good you telling me just vote, but that's never how it really works. In order for a candidate, or a party for that matter, to be even remotely within a chance of winning, it's not the singular votes that matter, but rather the voting blocks made up of specific demographics that can be galvanized to vote for you. Now, doing it alone won't work. You do not have enough people power to do it. So, parties hire a team to do research on the best places to outreach, to canvass potential voters, to create communication materials, and so forth. Any look around at media bias will tell you that when people are given a greater spotlight on one side of an issue, they will be more influenced by that than another. Well, the same is true of electoral politics. More input from your chosen side will tip the odds and increase the chances of you winning. It goes without saying that all of this requires money and labor. Before long, it isn't just a simple act of voting, it's a whole electoral machine. After a while, the sheer scale of this might make you wonder, how much is all of this worth to me? How much time do I want to separate from radical activities? How many millions is that going to be? Money that is no longer being used to build anything, with no further education as to the enormity of electoral contradictions, and leaving a left largely blindsided with no capable avenue left until the same thing comes around in a few years. Are there not other avenues whereby this time and money can be better spent? I've seen for myself just how much more militant and active smaller direct action groups can be for their size and funding. Even just a dozen or so members. They're not constrained by legalistic jingo or electoral tradition. Sky's the limit. Imagine if they were bigger. What if that energy you would have put into electoralism you could instead use to build a base of people around a shared idea, to build further actions? You could use that money to buy cheap spaces and better ferment that base. Right there you're creating community power structures that can compete against the existing establishment. At the very least, this creates a voting bloc that politicians will be scrambling towards to get elected. In the event of getting cracked down upon, such groups will always offer some kind of significant result. New skills, infrastructure, contacts, legacy, and real-life on-the-ground recognition from the broader community. These groups are in the business of changing minds and empowering people, not playing goody-two-shoes to the opinions that get the most votes. At the end of the day, you're creating a base, one that distributes power and autonomy away from the consolidation of bureaucrats. And one that is constantly educating people towards alternatives, something that electoralism is inherently hostile to by its very nature. To do so would damage the structures that allow it to succeed. Whatever you think about it, This is for sure. If you don't vote, you can't complain, does not cut it. If you want to be consistent about this, it's if you don't campaign, then you can't complain. Because it's not the individual votes that get someone elected, it's the mass campaign that gathers enough of those blocks on a scale for your candidate to even remotely stand a chance. And the more support that campaign has, the better chance of winning. The lesser of two evils. The classic, otherwise known as the vote for harm reduction. Well, once more, your individual vote has little relevancy. Moreover, if you look throughout history, it's less about who exactly is in charge, so much as it is the interconnected dynamic of public legitimacy and the ability for a state to respond. The Democrats seemed pretty forward-thinking during their New Great Deal Society period, didn't they? And they were, for the most part, heads of both houses. But what were the circumstances involved? An economy on the brink? Then post-war practicalities, and finally a surge of disenfranchised people who now wanted their check. Together you have the perfect mixing pot for societal change. This is what's always ignored when it comes to the electoral question. External factors are sidelined, the main driver is who's in charge. My country also had a post-war forward-thinking person in government who's well known for implementing progressive reforms. But most of those ideas, for the most part, were shared across parties due to a variety of pre- and post-war factors. Nor were they challenged by the opposition. It took a recession to change that. A side point, whilst the Attlee government was implementing these reforms, themselves kick-started through imperial plunder, they were also crushing striking workers. The so-called spirit of 45 is very much a successful propaganda from the day that's been taken and inflated amongst trade unions and establishment lefties since then. The idea of old Labour being progressive is not all what it really appears, and it's something that has continued into the present day. I really wish run-of-the-mill lefties would stop romanticising old Labour. In the UK, we all like to talk about Thatcher this and Tories that. It's basically become a national pastime, especially in Liverpool. But if you look at all the events leading up to the winter of '78, which led to her succession, neoliberalism, or something thereof, was always going to happen, be it red or blue who instigated it first. The structures innate to society were far beyond anybody's control at that point, that a vote here or there would have solved it. If it saved us a year or two before the overflow, fine. But is that really where your energy is focused? Especially if it doesn't lead to anything. And then, of course, we see the swing back. The Tories had become unpopular by the 1990s due to a set of circumstances. And as such, the Reds got it again. Seems to me that after some time, it doesn't really matter whether you vote for one side or the other, because it's basically just a game of political seesaw. It's not to say that history is deterministic, but that change doesn't occur at the electoral level. It's always driven by much larger factors. Gay marriage, the Renters Reform Bill, and even Acorn UK all came about, or were funded by, initiatives from a Tory government. Now, was that progressive leadership? Or was that just simply the flow of societal change at the time? In my country, the Tories have had it for 12 years. 14 years. And now, for some reason, even without the support of a very strong socialist voting bloc, the opposition has, in many ways, a very clear-fire road to leadership. Now, is that due to Starmer's fantastic leadership? Or is it just happenstance? Also, I do need to highlight, so much of this discourse feels often like it's begging the question as to who the lesser evil is, which is often just based on words of the manifesto or the general vibes of a candidate. You're aware that some people can just lie, right? It's also neglecting the possibility that their policies or actions might even end up being worse than the greater evil. In Canada, it was the Liberal government of President Jean Chrétien which pushed forward neoliberalism, not the Conservatives. And as a further point, a lot of this lesser evil shit gets really, really murky once you escape the usual America and Western Europe metropole. In Turkey, you have the choice between a hard right-wing despot who, due to the geopolitical landscape, utilizes refugees as a way to sustain himself, or a more progressive opposition that is highly opposed to refugees. If you vote for this opposition, you will be voting to kick out many people who have no other choice. If I were to be incredibly charitable, at the very best, you would vote for a popular left-wing candidate. And no, I'm not talking put 10,000 more bobbies on the street level left-wing, I'm talking hang the parasites level left-wing. But bear in mind, these parties already had pre-existing bases at a very specific time and place in history, and they had proximity to Moscow. Hence why Americans funded the fuck out of their opponents. And even still, they themselves ended up becoming a very crapper and ineffectual shell of themselves as they went along this electoral road. Let me put it to you like this. If this is the lesser and greater evil on an axis of good versus evil, continued focus on voting for the lesser evil ignores the fact that evil in general is getting worse. Your prison systems keep on getting larger, your wages keep stagnating, your ability to find housing grows ever harder, inflation, the inequality between the rich and the poor grows wider, etc., etc. Because the factors involved in society at large are not putting up a fight to the establishment. And that is where our energy should be focused. But the right wing can do it. When the far right won elections in Italy, or when Roe v. Wade was overturned, many saw this as an example of why the right is so much better than the left at winning the electoral game. The right can get their act together and, they're getting along without petty arguments, why can't we just do that too? Why can't the left just do what I want them to do? Because we're not right-wing. We're not reactionary populists who can always fall back on people's understanding of the status quo. I really just don't get what people are going for with this. Why not just go all the way and become a patriotic socialist? It's the same point they're making. Yeah, tell you what, drop all your ACAP signs, drop all your pretenses towards having a spine, let's try and win over the hearts and minds of the police. Right? Yeah? Sound like a good idea? The left-wing struggle is harder because our goal is harder. We intend to make a complete transformation of the economic system. Not just a few goodie bags here and there. It's what separates us from people who fall back on tradition and money. Now, I'm sorry if this has been your entry to the left in recent years, but let me tell you something here. Socialism will not just be the way things are right now, but with worker ownership and all the nice things. Like restaurants. Restaurants are not going to exist, sorry. Nor will you achieve this road through reform. You have to imagine a world beyond the present state of things. If you can't imagine a society without restaurants as we know them, I think you're on the wrong track. The systems that have an interest in preserving the status quo are not going to be effective avenues towards toppling it. The only times it's ever been allowed is if it will further benefit those in charge. From my experience, those who choose to enter the electoral game will soon find that there are a lot of incentives to keep that stagnant train late, and so activists settle for what's popular. The conditions make them shirk those radical ideas. It'll happen to you, believe me. Now, you may have not thought about this, but in many ways the overturning of Roe v. Wade presents an opportunity for many Democrats, because it gives the perfect impetus for people to enter into that game. Hey, wanna fix the system? Join us! Further reinforcing it. If the right-wing tactic is through niggling at the state, then the left-wing tactic, as it always has been, is direct action. A decision like Roe v. Wade still would have passed had the Republicans had more power. The actions and influences of the women's movement at the time, and more radical steps like that of the Jane Collective, challenge the power of the establishment. After all, it's not the votes that make the change, it's the threat from below that makes them scramble for public legitimacy. Time after time, especially in America, elections are posed as the most important election of our time. Until this exact time next cycle. Yet whenever the preferred side wins and things keep on getting worse, the response is simply that there's nothing that can be done. Despite the fact that groups historically have shown that things can indeed be done. It's demonstrating a huge degree of creative apathy, on the same level, perhaps, as the average Marxist-Leninist. Now, those are the three main points for now, but until my final point, I know that there's a few nagging issues that some of you might be wondering. So, quick fire round. No, not very quick, but here we go. But your radical efforts didn't get to socialism either. That's correct. The road towards that is a very hard one. But this isn't really the argument that I'm making. Simply that it is a preferential alternative to the mainstream agenda. It at least allows experience and experimentation and control in that direction. One thing for sure that is not allowed through the constraints of electoral politics in the slightest. And to that end, I feel you're engaging in survivor bias. It's been observed that many of the concessions gained by reformists have only ever been listened to because of the sacrifices of radicals. One very notable example. Ex-revolutionaries said that voting is necessary. This has already been covered in older videos, but just to add, and this goes for everyone really, quotations are supposed to be used in addition to the argument, not as its core. In other words, you agree with the substance of that quote and then the person, not the person, then the quote.
Lenin has one. If Lenin jumped off a cliff, Lenin jumped off a cliff, I'm there.
Who are you to say this when you're not doing a revolution right now? I don't need to be doing this right now as I sit here recording this video in order for my point to make sense. Nor do I expect everyone to be doing a revolution. Because I understand that there are various physical, psychological, and economic reasons for why people cannot do such things. Will there need to be something like this eventually? Will there need to be such actors? Yes. But my point is a standard from which you can maybe go forward and make better steps. Not a demand. Need I also say, this is literally a right-wing talking point that silences progress. Don't believe me? Hey folks, Future Mouse here. Sorry to interrupt, but my edit was sadly interrupted. I was going to link to an old video response made to me by the great Carl Benjamin. Unfortunately, he's since nuked most of his videos. Pity. So you'll just have to believe me. In his own words, if I want to propose a revolution to overthrow capitalism, then I would first need to declare myself in active war against the state, and if I don't actively brand myself a literal terrorist, then I am just LARPing. Because of course you cannot propose any method outside of the liberal ire without first grabbing an AK. Funny how that works. Left-wing governments will allow a greater ability for people to become radicalized. That's just speculation. This is always just assumed as the outcome, when in fact there's probably more societal factors at bay, and yes, I am going to have to ask you for a bit more evidence there. Why can I not just argue that once seemingly radical groups enter an electoral position, they will simply kick back, relax, and enter the stage of just making sure that they can sustain power without going any further, even absorbing and suppressing groups that wish to do what they once promised, creating legitimacy of their slightly more tangential politics as the de facto left in the eyes of the public. I think you know what I'm talking about here. Never fixing the fundamental contradictions that will allow a more reactionary group to take power later down the line. We need a new party. No. Well, to be fair, most electoralists don't advocate this, but I included it because it does pose quite a funny contradiction. Without question, leveraging your vote for a third party would frighten the existing lesser evil into changing their views far more than a "we will vote for you no matter what, so don't worry about shifting policies." Keir Starmer undoubtedly knows this, which is why his strategy has been focused on winning over potential swing voters instead of ideological left-wingers. He knows that that camp is safe, especially Liverpool. Imagine if it wasn't. Historically, third parties, even in the US, have been strong indicators and influencers of change in a country's strategy. The GOP themselves were once a third party. I'm not implying that they'll win, but you'd be a fool to argue that enough bargaining via votes being siphoned away wouldn't influence the direction of the most popular ones. and there is proof that third parties can become the second party. The Brexit phenomena in the UK only gained prominence because the UK Independence Party was taking away numerous votes from the Conservatives. Despite never winning more than 2 seats, they very nearly won more than 100. Their threat alone was enough to trigger the referendum. After this, they quickly lost relevance. I would still argue that this removes power from us, and it's not money that's being used in towards a radical aim, just that if I have any respect for electoralists, this would be your only option. And especially given what's happening right now in Gaza and Genocide Joe's support of it, is this not the perfect time for you to send a message? By the way, if you are going to vote third party in the US, purely just for my own sanity, please don't vote PSL. They are absolute hot garbage, and I would urge you to investigate further. Not voting is a privilege. You wouldn't be saying that stuff if you were on the fringes of society. The protection of vulnerable groups is a very understandable concern, but ultimately this claim doesn't have as much punch as you might think. Like I said, your individual vote does little to affect the nature of these things. Moreover, one could argue that third-party leverage does act as fighting for minority rights through bargaining, just via the long game. The topic of privilege is also not as cut and dry as you may believe either. The same could also be turned around on you.
If you don't believe in that system, don't ask me to vote. If you don't actually believe that my vote means anything in that context, oh, well, you know, you're throwing away your vote. Why do you believe in this system? Because you are okay with where we are right now. And that is privilege, and we've been trying to tell you that coming to us and saying it's going to get so much worse is the most, tone-deaf take in the history of politics. Because clearly then it's not gotten worse enough for you.
But what I have found quite surprising when doing my research, against what I thought was going to be the case, is that the overwhelming majority of testimonies that I came across putting forward criticisms of electoralism happened to be from people of colour and LGBT. A common sentiment shared by the former crowd: yes, it would be worse. For you. I've got nothing to lose. I don't want to vote genocide. Or my favourite, Project 2025, I'm still dealing with Project 1776. Again, nothing definitive, but it does showcase that the opinion is much broader than many electoralists seem to be implying, and those voices, I think, might want to be heard more. Your ideas are accelerationism. No, they're not. Accelerationism as it's being used today is just another one of those words that people fling around divorced from the original meaning. Accelerationism can be referred to as speeding up class struggle by supporting the destruction of worker solidarity and gains, then expecting those people to create socialism. It doesn't work. People just become disillusioned. What I have stated is a move towards alternative structures and building bases of power, whereby we can uphold and increase those gains and protections and would be an actual threat, which in doing so create favourable conditions as more and more people become actively politicised. You can't just say accelerationism to anything you don't like. There will always be rich libs who will want to do the party stuff. That doesn't mean that we have to. Having had experience in parties, I can assure you that they're not all just rich libs. Many of the rank and file that party depends on are the on-the-ground working class people. And have you noticed that there's a bit of a contradiction here? If you're reliant on politically active libs to win the election through campaign work, aren't those exactly the sorts of people that we need to be socialists and fighting for a new society? Fact still remains, more support, even from socialists, more money, more labour, will increase the odds of you winning. So my statement still stands. Alright, just one more, because it's quite funny. Okay, have fun in the camps then. This one is brilliant on so many levels. The defeatism, the lack of focus, and the complete ignorance of how fascism gained power in the first place. To name just Nazi Germany, the fascists grew in power due to the failure of the working class movement to provide a winning alternative, not because there wasn't enough democracy or something like that. Save that what you want. It was helped in no part due to the equivalent centre-left party in Germany the SPD, who at nearly every opportunity violently repressed its ability to grow. If your takeaway from this is vote fascism away, then you're effectively saying to the working class movement, shut up and die, and then blame them when they don't want to vote for the same people who shot them down. Fact is, it was the Social Democrats, the lesser evil, the ones that you insist that we vote for, that provided all of the correct avenues for fascism to flourish. Study the SPD. They are a fantastic example of how initial socialist-minded groups succumb to the conditions that they legitimize. I hope that if you do agree with my line of thinking here, that you don't get too dogmatic about not voting. If it is practical, and easy, and not too much faff, then go for it. I'm not stopping you. In a democracy, as you call it, that's your privilege, right? There's no need to get too burnt up over it all. Individual voting, like I say, is not the issue. To go on from this, if it happens that single-issue voting situations arise that have a very clear benefit, then you should probably go for it as well. It's so far removed from that special hell of the electoral machines. Bear in mind, though, it might appear like a symbol of teenage angst, but the words voting only legitimizes the system aren't exactly as juvenile as you may think. There's very good logic to suggest that encouraging the act of voting in this machine reduces the feeling of agency that individuals have, pushing them into the realm of bureaucrats, even third party. That it's a self-fulfilling dynamic that reinforces the system. Fighting against that, showcasing apathy or anger that one has from a very principled point, is not quite as juvenile as one may think. If Starmer does get a supermajority, yeah, it'll be funny that the Tories are reduced to a shell of their former selves, but again, it's that Tories are the enemy narrative that ultimately wins. In the line of history, those votes will simply legitimize him in the eyes of the public. A return to normalcy. Capitalism continues, especially in Liverpool. It's not innately true that systems become more despotic the less people partake in that system, just so long as that apathy is being funneled into other channels that can then become the new legitimacy. But going on from this, I think one of the most pernicious problems with electoralism, beyond simply sapping us of our agency, is how, given time, it reduces all political energy down to how do you convince people to vote for someone. And that is not politics. There are questions far more fitting of a radical left legacy than a 2-year freeze on mortgage rates. These might include degrowth, prison abolition, or the abolition of work as a concept. Whatever you think of these things right now, they're worth thinking about. They're on the level we ought to be striving towards. And it's good when we get people thinking outside the status quo, beyond the baggage that capitalist mindsets have left all of us with. We'll be building the new set of minds that can come up with the challenges of tomorrow. You might throw in the usual, yeah, nice thoughts, but that'll never bring people over. Well, I ask you, at what point? And at what context? And why must average schmoes be so deprived of their creativity? Might these be more grander, interesting questions that can attract people with a similar desire? What's with the fixation of bringing over everyone to our side anyway? We're not ad men. Perhaps we should try and attract the right people first. Quality over quantity. After all, history has often shown that there's nothing more dangerous than a small gang of troublemakers. The appeal to pragmatism appears indestructible. After all, if you're not pragmatic, then what are you? In reality, when this word is pointed to, it serves merely to avoid investigating more interesting alternatives that exist outside the status quo, that could drive an actual strong leftward movement, and in doing so alienating people from even beginning to entertain those grander concepts. How do you expect to go beyond reform if you're constantly saying, later, next time, we need to get ourselves together first? There is no end to this. Somebody needs to throw the brick sooner or later. It's like what I said at the beginning. Too many of us are stuck in this realm of we've got to sort this out first, ignoring that there will always be reactionary opposition. At some point, the only way to get over this hurdle is to act on our positions. In truth, we can do radical efforts and individually vote, yes. Yet in nearly every avenue, from radical electoralists, the hierarchy of reform and revolution is always weighted far too much towards the former. I've seen way too many self-proclaimed socialists settle for the slogan of reform while we can, revolt if we must, thinking that this is some kind of powerful, enlightened statement, and it's not. It's just intractable to any kind of radical change. Because again, it always pushes those ideals into long-off lofty goals, not things that we should all be working on right now. Nobody ever won a negotiation by demanding practical demands. They asked for the world, and they got somewhere. So in that sense then, the moderate goals are done when they become available, and our main job is in those radical efforts. That is as much as I would be willing to concede, and I am not compromising on this. Too much of the left has been taken down this reformist path, and I've had 11 years to see that it is a complete dead end. At least with this strategy, you will then have the political force that will affect moderate change as a secondary measure, instead of the impoverished historic tactic of tailism. Which is what you're doing, by the way. You're tailing the capitalists. You can go ahead and yell Puritan all you want, ignoring all the points I've made, and yes, I'll be the first one to say that there are some who follow my train of thought who might get a bit too burn the earth prone. But I'd invite you to consider that even the most hellish Puritan is by far a lesser evil to the far more popular hell of an opportunist who deviates the revolutionary current in favor of supposed mass appeal and personal gain. One is very easy to spot and just ends up with them mostly alienating themselves. The other is far more dangerous, because it attaches itself to popular common sense narratives, and doesn't need to justify itself beyond that. So many people are tricked and pulled asunder with an embiggened sense of self-assurance, and this leads to defeatism, vulgar pragmatism, sad militancy, and the loss of radical creativity. The same impulses for socialists to favour the electoral strategies are also used by left liberals to favour more broad candidates. There is no end to this. One reason I have heard as to why many ardent voters might think that way, whether they realise it or not, is that the failure of their movement to win would force themselves to stop pretending and start organising seriously in the same way people already on the fringes of society have had to do for a long time now. Of course, what should be very evident within all of this is that despite the poverty of voting, not voting alone also doesn't make a difference. Part of the reason why there is such an obsession with voting, besides being brought up with it, is due to the lack of viable alternatives available. Now that's the reason, but of course it doesn't mean that you should be promoting it. Someone's got to start somewhere. And I won't lie, it's hard building a grassroots movement free from any of the financial strings of the establishment. And it's often very demoralizing. But it's necessary. And if you and those around you have the capacity to do it, you should give it a try. Embrace the unknown. It's a tough few years ahead of us, and the problems we are facing right now will not be solved with another election. Funnel that apathy into channels that can create real change.